Today's webinar is brought to you by the Grandview Group on behalf of the Life Story Library Foundation. My name is David Brake, CEO of the Grandview Group. Our special guest presenter today is David Hutchens. David is a best-selling author, business writer, and learning designer who has created communication solutions for Coca-Cola, Walmart, IBM, GE, Nike, Bank of America, and several other national brands. He serves as chairman of the Storytelling in Organizations, a special interest group of the globally renowned National Storytelling Network. David also speaks to organizations and leadership teams all around the world on the topic of storytelling as an organizational capacity. His new book is Circle of the Nine Muses, a storytelling field guide for innovators and meaning makers, available through John Wiley & Sons. The focus of today's webinar is on how to create an environment to help you or your organization receive and hear a story, which is a little bit counterintuitive because most people think of telling when talking about story. If you have questions for David, and I'm sure you will, please use the dialog box on your screen to post your question. If you're one of several people participating today in a phone-only mode, you can email, text, or Skype your questions directly to me. We may not be able to get to all of the questions, but we'll tackle as many as we can at the end of David's presentation. And now it is my pleasure, my distinct pleasure, to turn the time over to David Hutchens.
Thank you, Dave, for that introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. And at the end of this program, we will have time for questions and answers at the end. So if you're joining us online, there is a Q&A window where you are welcome to type in your questions, and we'll take a look at those towards the end of the program. And yeah, let's explore this idea of story listening and meaning making. And today, I work with leaders in big organizations all around the world to help them build their skill as storytellers. And yeah, that's the subject of my new book, Circle of the Nine Muses. And I'll share a little bit more with you about that in a little while. But it's funny because these days, a lot of people are asking for help with this, with storytelling. I mean, it's right there in the word, telling, right? Everyone is saying, help me tell better stories. But not too many people are asking for help with listening. They're not saying, hey, Dave, can you help us be a more welcoming presence? I mean, no one's saying that. And yet, that's where all the power is. Everyone thinks the teller has the power, but it's actually the listener who has more influence on the story experience. I recently partnered with my friends at the Life Story Library at a really fascinating event called the Parliament of World Religions. It was a global gathering that seeks to increase dialogue across hundreds of different religions. And so this was a different kind of gig for me because, I'm used to working with corporate executives. But it was a beautiful few days receiving and listening to stories from people all around the world, stories of faith, stories of abuse, stories of empowerment and healing. And we were very purposeful about how we designed that event. Our role was to be present and to witness the stories. And we weren't there as interviewers. And that's an important distinction that I made early in the process. An interviewer guides the dialogue. Interviewers have control. Our role was to receive stories with full presence. And that's a different skill set. And the results were, I've never experienced anything quite like it. And so I want to share with you today some of those ideas with you. And these are ideas you can use anytime you want to create a safe, authentic story sharing experience. So this could be if you do community dialogue work like Life Story Library does, or if you're a leader, bringing together your team for a richer kind of discourse, which is where my work is most often. Or if you're in a healing context and you're using stories for therapeutic purposes, or even if you just want to engage with your kids at the dinner table in a deeper way. And I have found that there are 3 phases that deserve our attention. And if you're online, you should be able to see the slides advance. And if you're just listening, if you can't see the slides, that's okay. I'll talk you through it. But there's 3 phases for creating this story receiving experience. So rather than just going up to someone and saying, hey, tell me your story, we create this space by hosting a series of activities that are invitation, reception, and appreciation. And let's start with this idea of invitation. And I think that's powerful language, invitation. You know, we think of invitation as a card that comes in the mail to tell us about a party or a wedding. But we don't often experience it as a spirit for encountering other people. And what if we did? You know, at the Parliament for World Religion event, I met an Israeli woman there, and I explained why we were there, and I said, your story is a powerful gift to this community, and we would like to invite you to come join us in our story booth to share it. And I'll never forget what she said. She said, you know, I tell my story all the time. And she said, I'm good at telling my story. And she said, I make people listen to my story, you know, on the bus or when I'm at the park. But I've never had anyone ask me for my story. And she said, this feels very different. And she was very moved. And I was too. And then she shared a very beautiful and honest story about her history of abuse. And it was a sacred moment. And so it begins with this spirit of invitation. And it is a spirit. It's an orientation that you have to choose. You know, I had a friend tell me that when he encounters another person, especially an unfamiliar person or someone who may seem alien to his way of life, he said he chooses to turn to wonder. Turn to wonder. You expect to encounter mystery and beauty and truth in the unfamiliar other. It makes me think of the poet John Keats, who said, I am certain of nothing but the holiness of the heart's affection and the truth of the imagination. What if we approached others in wonder, seeking those kinds of riches from them? So since my background is in learning, I'm always looking for behaviors. You know, tell me what to do. So yeah, it begins internally with this mind shift that I'm describing, turn to wonder, but then it shows up in your language and in your behaviors. And so this depends on the format of your event or your context. You may have a formal event and process like we did at the Parliament, or maybe a more informal setting. So begin by stating your intent. I want to hear from you. I want to learn from you. Or maybe it's, and this is the one we used at the Life Story Library, I want to share the gift of your stories where they will become part of our online story library. And then use the language of invitation. I'd like to invite you to share your story. It can be that simple. You know, I predict you'll see the person soften. You'll feel a shift happen. And then share a very specific question of the story that you would like to receive from them. And so this is a big part of my work. You know, how you ask for the story matters. Story is incredibly sensitive to language and context. You know, if I said to you, say, hey, what do you think about the latest news headline last night? That won't generate a story. You'll give me an opinion, which will be a very different kind of conversation, but we're looking for stories. And so we need different language here. And so I usually begin the question with the phrase, tell me about a time. And this gets people to search the timelines of their experience. It's historical. It places their mindsets in an event. If you can see the screen, this is the question that we used at the Parliament. This came from the wonderful leader of the Life Story Library, Paulette Stevens. She said, tell me about a turning point in your life. The phrase turning point has the same effect as tell me about a time. But this proved to be a really powerful question because it got people to think about challenges, or perhaps pain, or perhaps conflict. And we found that people shared some of the most meaningful moments from their lives. But the question depends on the event. If you're a leader with your team, your question might be, tell me about a time you felt you were at a best as a leader. You know, I mean, the possibilities here are endless. In my book, Circle of the Nine Muses, I have an entire chapter on how questions will frame the story experience. Growth always happens for people and for groups in the direction of the questions we ask. So this is a rich topic for our exploration. Think of the conversation you want to have, whether it is around leadership or learning or faith or resilience or whatever it is that's brought you together, and then ask the person to tell me about a time you had a meaningful experience with that. And now they're ready to bring you the gift of their story. And that's what brings us to the next part of the story experience, which is reception. Prepare for a really wonderful experience now for you and the storyteller. Riches are about to be delivered. Here, you get to witness another human being, someone possibly very different or even alien to your experience, sharing their experiences, their beliefs, their mental models, their emotions, their hearts. And a lot of time the teller will begin by asking me questions. You know, people might have a performance anxiety about this. You know, how long do you want my story to be? Should I just start talking? Should I share anything? How much detail do you want? And so I respond with the most empowering language I can. This is your story. You know how it needs to be told. I'll let you decide. Now, if there are time limits in your process, then go ahead and share those. You know, we want the stories to be no more than 5 minutes in length, or you know, we're recording these, so we're mindful of time, or whatever. But overall, don't burden the process with a lot of boundaries. And then once the teller begins telling their story, simply receive it. Now, if you're on the computer, if you can see my slide, you can see the illustration at the top of the slide. And that's not clip art. That is actually an image from a story experience I was a part of. I took the photo and I traced over it in Adobe Illustrator to make it art and to hide the identities. But I think that even in that abstract form, it's a fascinating image. Look at their postures and their positions in relation to one another. You know, what kind of experience do you think the two people in this image are having? When I receive stories, whether it's in a business setting or with my family, I often find myself becoming very still. I start noticing my breathing. It becomes whole body listening. I notice where I feel the story in my physicality. I've noticed some people receive stories kind of in an exaggerated way, They start nodding their heads vigorously, and they keep saying things like, wow, oh, okay. And, maybe this is a preference, but to me that somehow feels intrusive. Because when I become still and fully present, I find that I don't even move very much, but I'm certain that the teller is responding to imperceptible visual cues that I'm giving off. And I don't even ask too many questions. Remember, this isn't an interview. I'll ask a quick question to clarify something if needed, but mostly it's the other person's voice that is filling the story space. Just yesterday, I found a poem that perfectly captures the experience. And when I read this, I thought, oh, that's it. I have to share this with my friends on the webinar tomorrow. This poem is called Finding What You Didn't Lose. It's by the American poet John Fox. He creates poetry for use in therapeutic settings. But listen to this. Finding What You Didn't Lose. When someone deeply listens to you, it is like holding out a dented cup you've had since childhood and watching it fill up with cold, fresh water. And when it balances on top of the brim, you are understood. When it overflows and touches your skin, you are loved. When someone deeply listens to you, the room where you stay starts a new life, and the place where you wrote your first poem begins to glow in your mind's eye. It is as if gold has been discovered. When someone deeply listens to you, your bare feet are on the earth, and a beloved land that seemed distant is now at home within you. Isn't that lovely? It's called Finding What You Didn't Lose by John Fox. And yes, I do believe that kind of listening and experience has a place in the organizational world, in the world of big companies. I find that the leaders in my program crave that. People everywhere are starving to be heard, starving to be received, starving to have their stories witnessed in this way. So the teller will continue to tell their story, and you will receive it, and they will come to the end of their story, and they may even say something like, so that's my story. And then they will look to you. And that brings us to the final stage of the experience, which is appreciation. And again, let's make this behavioral. So often, after someone has shared their story, I take a deep breath, like a cleansing breath, and I give them a smile. Kind of like that, and it has the effect of, it's kind of like bringing up the house lights at the end of a great play. It's like you've now exited the story space in a sense. And I guarantee you'll find yourself wanting to say the words, thank you. And you should. That's the right response when someone gives you a gift. Thank you for telling me your story. So much of my work focuses on meaning making in stories. And the idea is that the story is loaded with so much information, and the good stuff starts to happen after the story is told. It's appropriate to feed back some of what you heard and experienced to the teller. So now this becomes your gift back to them. And several of my colleagues in the organizational narrative space, like Paul Costello or Mary Alice Arthur or Cynthia Kurtz, have proposed meaning-making frameworks that say that there are different ways to share and find meaning in the story. And this is one I use and talk about in Circle of the Nine Muses. And so the idea is that meaning has its own geography. Meaning occurs within and around the story. And so you may choose to feed back to the teller what you heard from any of these orientations. And so the slide is showing an image with the three orientations that say there's meaning from within the story text, from behind the story text, or in front of the story text. And this might sound abstract, but it's really not hard to do. So start with behind the story text. And here the listener serves as witness. And in this orientation, what you're giving back to the teller is, I noticed something about you, or my reaction, or us, or the experience. So you're commenting on the story phenomenon. So it may be, I notice you have a quiet strength about you. And when you share the most painful parts of your story, that's when you become the most committed. And that's when I see your leadership step forward. That's just an example. I'm making stuff up. There's no wrong answer here. It's what did you notice about the other person? What did you notice about yourself? It may be, as you told your story, I lost awareness of the room around me. I didn't even notice other people. Or I found my heart beating faster. Or I found myself feeling the things that you were describing. So you are witness to anything that you noticed about the person, yourself, or the experience. And simply getting that feedback from the listener can be incredibly empowering for the teller to know that their story affected somebody in that way. So that's behind the text. The next orientation is from within the text. Here the listener serves as harvester. You know, imagining harvesting a crop of grain. You're bringing in that nutritious goodness of the story. This is, I noticed something inside your story. And this would be similar to if you've ever analyzed a work of literature. It's, I heard some patterns in your story. Or that was really a story about trust. And the storyteller will say, oh, it was? I hadn't thought of it that way. And you'll say, yeah, I heard trust all over that story. And the teller will say, wow, yeah, I guess you're right. That makes sense. So again, this is appreciative feedback. This is what you heard that was good. And again, there's no wrong answers. It's whatever connections you make within the text of the story. And then the third orientation is in front of the text. Now the listener becomes connector. This is where the listener says, your story made me realize something. I thought of something. Your story revealed something, if it's in an organization, your story revealed something that I think is true of our entire team. Or there was a leadership behavior in your story that if other people adopted that behavior, just think how great things would be around here if everybody did this. So now you're taking the content of the story and you're connecting it to the future. You're using the content to pull us forward. Now we can do something different. Now we can be something different. So again, those are the three orientations. That's the geography of meaning. I feed back meaning to you from behind the story, from within the story, or from in front of the story. Now, if you're in a formal setting like we were at the Parliament for World Religions, this could be hours of conversation. Depending on the context, at the Parliament, it was 30 seconds of feedback. People tended to share very vulnerable and painful stories. So most often, I commented on what I heard about the strength or the resilience of the person who told the story. And over again, they gave feedback saying that was a profound experience. I've never told my story like that. And again, as the receiver of the story, I actually did very little work. It was through the work of the team, we created this story space where we could host people through invitation, through reception, and then through appreciation. And so this is a conversation that I'm having with leaders in big organizations around the world, and this process is now playing out at my own dinner table in some really remarkable ways. I see my kids, who are both teenagers, I haven't called out what I'm doing. I haven't I haven't shown them this PowerPoint deck, but this is what I've been doing, and they've started stepping into it as well, and they're asking for stories, and they're giving appreciative feedback, and it's really a lovely experience. And so that's the idea of listener as creating the space with huge influence on the story experience. I see we have a few minutes left together. Dave, how would you like to handle this? Are there questions that are coming in, or do you have comments?
David, we do have a couple of questions, and both of them relate to your experiences doing this. In other words, how easy is it for somebody who is not a professional to engage in this kind of dialogue or creating this story space?
The thing that's so empowering about this work is you don't have to be a professional. So many people hear the word storyteller, and that sounds like a performer. It sounds like Robin Williams. It's someone highly skilled in a spotlight, and it's not. We're all storytellers. We're all telling stories all day long. It's how we make sense of the world. And it continues. When we go to sleep at night, our brains continue telling us stories in the form of dreams. This is, the screenwriter, legendary screenwriter Roger McKee says story is equipment for living. So this is capability you already have. So we're not talking about turning into an amazing performer who tells perfect stories. You can stumble and stutter through the story, but simply inviting someone to tell a story, and then, often I don't even use the word storytelling. I'll say, what was the best thing that happened to you at school today? And my kids will start telling a story. They don't know that's what they're doing. They don't say that. They don't say, let me engage in some storytelling for meaning making. They just tell a story. And then I and my wife will say, wow, I heard something really cool in that story you just told. And my kids lean forward and they say, really? What did you hear? And then there are just incredible riches that you can continue to unpack from any story. Stories are such efficient containers of huge amounts of information. You can keep unpacking them. So this isn't hard. It's ask someone, tell me about it, tell me about the best thing that happened to you. Tell me about a time that you were stronger than you realized you were. Tell me about a time that you saw someone in our organization act on our value for quality or excellence. What happened? And then when someone tells you a story, just pay attention to yourself as you receive the story. It's really that easy. And everyone listening to this has that capability.
David, this question is about StoryCorps. Many of us hear that over National Public Radio, but the question is, do the folks at StoryCorps do something similar, do you think? In other words, how do they get the story from the people who record their stories? I don't know the answer to that. And I'm not sure that you would, David, but what's your guess? They want to know if the folks at StoryCorps follow a similar process.
I don't know StoryCorps very well. My sense of StoryCorps is that they make the technology available, whether it's through the app on your iPhone. Check out the StoryCorps app; it's really cool. Or through story booths that they'll set up. There's one coming here to my hometown of Nashville, Tennessee, in just a couple weeks. And so they provide the technology. I'm not sure there's any facilitation beyond that. But you know what? Even the act of providing a technology serves as a sort of invitation. It's a symbolic gesture that says, you deserve to be heard. Someone wants your story. And for many people, stepping into that booth or hitting record on the phone transforms the experience, and they have this awareness that I'm now sharing something that's sacred to me. And so even without the facilitation, it can still be a beautiful experience. I've started doing this with my parents. My parents are both in their 80s now. And we've done this with my wife's parents as well. When we're there for Thanksgiving or for a holiday, and we're all sitting around the table, we've finished our meal, I'll pull out my phone, and I don't use an app. I just hit, there's a record, a notes app. I hit record, and I'll say, Dad, tell me about that fight that you and Mom got in on your honeymoon. I'll give them a very specific prompt, and they're aware that they're being recorded. And their eyes will even kind of mist over. They become very emotional because they recognize that they're sharing something sacred. This is a sacred moment. Even though it's about something ridiculous, it's the fight on their honeymoon, or how you won your scholarship to Texas A&M, or something very specific. But there's this incredible gravity now because they know they're sharing it for posterity, and it ends up being an incredible gift, not just to my kids who get to hear grandmommy and granddaddy, but to them that they've been invited to share a part of their lives and share it and save it for posterity.
David, we have a group of elementary school teachers. From what I can gather, they're actually listening from a faculty lounge in Southern California today. And the question is, how can we do some of what you've suggested with our classrooms and our students?
I have a feeling this is already happening a lot in your classrooms. One thing I'm interested in is creating cultures of story. And I see my own kids with their iPads and iPhones, and they're losing it. They're losing their story ability. They're texting and tweeting, and that's not a story. And so in Circle of the Nine Muses, even though it's written to a business audience, there are processes in there for creating what's called a story circle. And it's really as simple as it sounds. Bring a group together, have them take turns telling stories around a very specific prompt that you give them, and make this a verbal experience. It's not written, it's spontaneous storytelling. And then there are things you can do to help others in the group say, hey, that story made me think of something. Or you may choose not to do that. Maybe they simply receive the stories. But simply bringing kids together to tell stories, and then what if you joined them? What if you told a story, depending on the age of your kids, that's age appropriate? If they're very young kids, if they're kindergarten age kids, for example, maybe it's a story about a time that you felt safe in the world, or a time that you found you were going to get your needs met in this world. So these very loving stories of how you became you. And then give them a turn to tell their stories as well. And then notice what happens. Notice what happens to behavior and posture and to the energy of the conversation. So if you check out Circle of the Nine Muses, there's lots of ideas in there for how to do that.
All right, and remember, folks, that's Circle of the Nine Muses, published in 2015 by John Wiley & Sons. There is a link on your screen where you can link right to the book. And if you're listening today, we'll send out a follow-up email, and we'll include a link where you can learn more about the book, as well as a link to a podcast that David Hutchens did with me. David, two more questions, and I know we're running short on time, but a lot of these questions that I'm seeing here have to focus on how-to. One of them is, I want to do this at my next family reunion. What equipment do I need, and what's your quick advice on how to make that happen?
Quick advice is, one, you can do it informally and spontaneously. Two is what I just described using my iPhone. You see how introducing a technology suddenly kind of puts a frame around the event. Now there's this awareness of, oh, we're doing something here. And I find that when I do that, others at the table get quiet, and it focuses attention on the teller. At family reunions, I've seen this done, where hang up a sheet in the corner. So you've got a nice white background. Get an iPad, put it on a stand, and point the iPad at the sheet, and now you have a movie studio. It's that easy. And take members, select members of your family or anybody that wants to come up. Invite them. Here's where we bring in the language of invitation. I want to capture the memories and the history of the Jones family. And I know that here there's a wealth of stories that we've never heard. So whenever you're ready, just come on over here to the corner. I'll be here for a while. And I'd like to invite you to tell your stories. And tell me a story about, now then you give them a specific prompt. Maybe use Paulette Stevens' prompt of tell me a story about a turning point in your life in this family. And people will self-select. They'll probably line up and then hit record and simply capture their stories. And now you have this beautiful archive of family stories, and everybody in that room is going to want copies of those videos. It's that easy.
David, our final question. We seem to have a lot of educators on today, not just teachers, but this is from a superintendent back in Tennessee, a school superintendent who apparently has read your works or been in one of your seminars before. But his question is, how do you suggest I capture the stories of people inside our district and use that to help tell the story of our district? He made reference to some of the work that you've done with Coca-Cola and other companies. I'm reading between the lines here, but I think what he's really trying to determine is how can he use the stories from within his group to tell a powerful story about their school district.
Is the story also about how to capture the stories and make them available?
I don't.
Is that the question?
I don't have that in the question.
Okay. There's a lot of thinking right now on this. That we're stepping into the world of knowledge management is what this discipline is called. How do we take what the organization knows and capture it in a way that we can do something with it? And the simplest and very much a powerful way is to make it a social experience. So simply to do what we've been describing of creating story circles. And this is a lot of my work, is bringing the organization together in the room and placing them in circles where they can hear one another and receive one another's stories. And then there's lots of techniques of, putting sticky notes up on the wall and, extracting some meaning out of them and finding themes and patterns and defining, what's the bigger story we're hearing in all of this. So there's lots of ways to do this in real time, face-to-face. There's also lots of questions around how can you put stories in a database? Can you tag them so that people can search for stories and share them, maybe comment on them and draw from them? I urge you to go check out again the Life Story Library and the work of Paulette Stevens with that organization. She's doing this at a community level. Bringing people of the community in together and capturing them on video. Now we've got these knowledge archives, these stories captured on video. How do we put them online? How do we put them in a database so that we can do something with them? There's a lot of technology that can help you do that.
David, I want to thank you. Folks, you've been listening to a webinar today with David Hutchens. David, among other things, is the author of Circle of the Nine Muses, available from the publisher Wiley, published in 2015. This webinar is brought to you today by the Grandview Group, produced for the Life Story Library Foundation. David has mentioned the Life Story Library Foundation and the good work of Paulette Stevens, and I know that there are a number of members of the Life Story Library Foundation who are with us today. I want to thank the Life Story Library Foundation and Paulette for helping to make this possible. And David, it's been a pleasure being a participant myself, hearing what you've had to share, and we thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone. Happy story listening to you all.